The sun was sinking low over the San Pedro Valley, turning the cliffs into rivers of red light. Dust drifted like ghost smoke through the air, glowing in the dying sun. Somewhere high among the rocks, a girl's cry broke the silence, thin, trembling, and carried by the wind like a wounded bird's song. Tayen lay on the edge of a narrow ledge, one arm stretched toward the sky as if begging the clouds for mercy. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks, tangled with blood and grit. The jagged stones had torn her skin open from shoulder to thigh. Her horse, a chestnut mare she had raised since a foal, lay motionless below, its body twisted, neck broken. She tried to move, but pain shot through her leg like a knife. A shard of bone pressed against her skin. The sight made her stomach turn. She clenched her teeth, bit back a sob, and dragged herself toward a patch of shade beneath a crumbling overhang. The rocks burned under her palms, still hot from the afternoon sun. For a long while there was only the rasp of her breathing and the endless whisper of the wind. The world seemed vast and uncaring. She looked out over the valley, the dry riverbeds, the thorn brush, the faraway line of blue hills. Somewhere out there men rode with rifles slung across their saddles, the same traders who had come to her village that morning. They had promised trade. Then the shouting started. Her father's voice, the first gunshot, her mother's scream, the sound of horses scattering. Tayen had run, clutching a bundle of herbs, thinking she could draw them away from her younger brothers, but they had chased her through the canyon. A rifle cracked, her horse stumbled, and the world turned to stone and sky. Now there was only silence. Her lips were dry, her tongue thick with dust. She lifted her face toward the horizon and whispered, "Amma, mother." The wind answered, low and lonely, echoing through the cliffs. Tayen's vision blurred. She thought of her mother's hands weaving her braids, of the songs by the fire, of the smell of sage smoke that once meant home. She was so tired. The ache in her bones deepened, heavy and slow. She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart struggle against the pull of darkness. If she could only rest a little, she thought. Just close her eyes until the pain drifted away. But then came another sound, a soft rustle among the rocks. Not the wind. A footstep. Tayen froze, heart pounding. She reached for the knife strapped to her belt, but her fingers slipped in her own blood. The blade clattered against the stone. "Who's there?" She rasped in Apache, her voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Only the crunch of gravel, closer now. A shadow moved along the cliff face, tall and silent. The glint of metal flashed, perhaps a weapon. She tried to crawl backward, dragging her useless leg, leaving a trail of red across the gray stone. "Stay back," she cried. The effort tore her throat raw. The figure stopped, half hidden by the fading light. For a moment, Tayen thought it was one of the traders come to finish what they started. But then the man spoke, his voice calm, low in her own tongue. "Do not move," he said. "You will fall." His tone was neither threat nor command, it was quiet concern like water after fire. Tayen blinked through the haze. The man stepped closer, the light touching his face. He was Apache, dark braids, painted bow slung across his back, a scar along his jaw. His eyes, sharp and watchful, softened when they met hers. Who are you?" she whispered. He crouched beside her, studying the wound on her leg. "Dasan," he said simply, "from the high ridge. You cry loud enough to wake the spirits." Tayen wanted to answer, to tell him she didn't cry for herself but for her family. But her voice broke, and only tears came. Dasan looked toward the valley, scanning for riders, then back to her. "You should not be here alone," he murmured. Then after a long pause, his voice dropped to a whisper. The wind nearly stole away. "No one should die alone on the cliff." Before darkness claimed her, Tayen felt his hands, warm, strong, lifting her gently from the stone. Somewhere in her fading consciousness, she thought she heard him whisper a prayer to the Great Spirit, and though her body was broken, her heart began to steady, guided by that quiet promise. The night was deep and silver when Dasan descended the cliffside with the girl in his arms. The moon poured cold light over the desert, turning the rocks into bones and the sand into frost. Each step was deliberate, silent, his breath low and steady, like a man carrying not a body, but a prayer. The girl, Tayen, she had murmured before sleep claimed her, was light as a bundle of feathers, yet every movement drew a groan from her wounded leg. Dasan could feel the fever already rising beneath her skin. Her pulse fluttered against his arm like the wings of a trapped bird. He moved with a hunter's caution, his moccasins soundless on the sand. The desert below was vast and merciless. Coyotes howled far off, their cries blending with the sigh of the wind. He scanned the horizon constantly. Somewhere beyond the black ridges, riders might still be searching, the ones who had burned her village. He did not know why he had gone toward that cry. He had sworn to stay clear of all that reminded him of war and death. Once, long ago, he had ridden under the same moon as a scout for his people, tracking, striking, killing when needed. He had been good at it, too good. The blood on his hands had never washed away. After his brother's death in a cavalry raid, Dasan had vanished into the wilderness, taking nothing but his horse, his bow, and his silence. For 2 years, he had spoken to no one, until tonight. When he reached the valley floor, he laid Tyen down near a cluster of mesquite trees. The air was sharp with the scent of sage and smoke. He gathered dry branches and struck flint against stone until a small flame caught. The firelight painted his face in copper and shadow. Dasan tore a strip from his own tunic and cleaned the wound on her leg, whispering under his breath in the old language, the words of protection his grandmother had taught him. Tyen stirred, her lips parting. "The traitors! They took my family," she whispered, not truly awake. "My mother, my brothers." Dasan paused. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the fire. The words echoed through him like the echo of old pain. He knew that kind of loss. He had carried it for years. "They will not find you here," he said quietly. "Sleep," she did. Her breathing slowed, steady at last. Dasan leaned back against a stone, keeping watch. The flames flickered low and the stars wheeled slowly above. His mind wandered to the mountains far north, the sacred ridges where his people once gathered before the wars. He had not seen them in years. Sometimes he wondered if he ever would again. A rustle nearby made him reach instinctively for his knife, but it was only a desert fox slinking past, drawn by the smell of blood. He tossed a stone, sending it skittering away. The night returned to silence. He studied Tyen in the firelight. She was young, too young to carry the scars of battle and loss. A streak of dried blood crossed her cheek like war paint. Even in her sleep, her brow was furrowed, her lips moving as if she still spoke to the spirits of those she'd lost. Dasan exhaled slowly. "You should have died up there," he murmured to himself. "Yet you did not. Perhaps the spirits have not finished with you." He turned his gaze toward the horizon. The moon hung low now, pale and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's lonely call rose again, and the sound felt less like hunger and more like mourning. Before dawn, he rose quietly and walked a few paces away from the fire. Kneeling on one knee, he drew a handful of sand and let it fall through his fingers. He spoke softly in Apache, a prayer for strength and for meaning in what the Great Spirit had placed before him. When he returned to the camp, Tyen was awake, her eyes glassy with fever but clear enough to focus on him. Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice dry as dust. Dasan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because I heard a cry," he said simply, "and I remembered what it felt like when no one came." Tyen's eyes shimmered with tears she didn't shed. The fire crackled softly between them, two wounded souls facing each other across the silence of a sleeping desert. As the first light of morning touched the cliffs, Dasan stood, slung his bow across his shoulder, and looked east. The sun rose blood-red. Another day had come, one that neither of them was meant to face alone. By mid-morning, the desert shimmered beneath the rising sun, a sea of gold and white heat. Dasan had been awake for hours, searching the arroyos for water and herbs, leaving Tyen hidden beneath the shade of a split boulder. When he returned, his arms carried a water skin, a bundle of yucca roots, and a strip of bark torn from a willow, bitter medicine for pain. Tyen stirred as his shadow fell across her. Her face was pale, eyes half open, sweat beading along her brow. She tried to sit up, but the movement sent a cry through her teeth. "Easy," Dasan said, kneeling beside her. His voice was steady but quiet, the kind that expected obedience. "Your leg is broken. If you fight it, it will never heal." Her breath came shallow. They'll find me." "Not here." He poured water over her cracked lips, then handed her the skin. "Drink." She obeyed, gulping greedily until he took it back. "Too fast," he said, almost smiling. "Even water can kill if you rush." For a moment they were silent except for the hum of insects and the whisper of wind across the sand. Dasan crushed the willow bark between two stones and mixed it with water until it turned to a dark paste. He wrapped it in cloth, then bound it against her wound with careful hands. "You know healing," she said faintly. He shrugged. "I learned enough to keep myself alive." Tyen's gaze flickered to his face. Those deep-set eyes, the faint scars across his cheek, the hardness that seemed carved from stone. "Are you a warrior?" she asked. "I was." He tied the last knot and leaned back. "Not anymore." She wanted to ask more, but a tremor passed through her. The pain and heat had worn her thin, and soon she slipped into half-sleep. Dasan sat beside her, sharpening his knife on a stone, every sense tuned to the land around them. The desert was never truly still. Every sound meant something, the buzz of a fly, the cry of a hawk, the distant echo of hooves. Near noon he caught it, the faint rhythm of horses, not wild, too steady, too many. He rose at once, scanning the horizon. Far off in the glare he saw them. 5 riders winding through the canyon, their rifles glinting in the light. He didn't need to look twice to know who they were. Traitors, killers, the same men who had burned the girl's home. He dropped to one knee beside her and pressed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Tyen," he whispered. "Wake." Her eyes fluttered open. "What is it?" "Riders. They come this way." Fear replaced the haze in her gaze. "Then leave me. Save yourself." Dasan's brow furrowed. "If I leave you, they'll find you before the sun moves a hand. You can't carry me again, you'll be seen." "Then we hide differently." He worked fast. From his pouch he took ashes from the fire and rubbed them over the bandages to dull their white color. He pulled loose brush and sand over her body until she looked almost part of the ground itself. Only her face remained uncovered. "What about you?" she whispered. "I will draw them away." Before she could argue, he took her hand. Rough fingers, warm and strong. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. I will return when the wind changes." Her eyes searched his. "Why would you do this for me?" He hesitated. Then softly, "Because someone once did not." Without another word, he took his bow and moved off through the rocks, vanishing like smoke. Tyen listened to the faint scrape of his footsteps until there was nothing but the wind. The sun beat harder now, and she lay still beneath the brush, every breath a whisper. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, voices, laughter, men. Through a slit in the branches she saw them, dust-covered riders scanning the valley. One dismounted and walked close enough that she could see the sweat glistening on his neck. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure they would hear it. He turned toward the rocks, frowning. "Tracks," he muttered. Another man cursed. "Apache trail. Maybe the girl's not dead after all." They followed the prints eastward, the direction Dasan had taken. Tyen pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, fighting the cry rising in her throat. And then, faint but clear, an echo rolled back from the canyon, a hawk's cry. 1, then 2. Tyen closed her eyes. Dasan's signal, relief and dread mingled inside her. He had found them, and they had found him. As the sound faded into the distance, she whispered a prayer in Apache, the first she had dared since the raid. The desert listened in silence. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the battle for her life had already begun. The desert turned cruel when the sun reached its peak. Tyen lay half-buried under brush and sand, her skin burning, her mouth dry as bone. Every breath drew fire into her chest. She couldn't tell how long Dasan had been gone, minutes, hours, or the endless turning of the sun. The heat made time dissolve. The silence stretched too long. Then, faintly, she heard it, gunfire. 1 shot, then 2. The echo bounced off the cliffs, swallowed by the wind. She shut her eyes and pressed her hand against her heart as if that might steady it. Somewhere out there, the man who had saved her was fighting for her life. She wanted to believe he would return. But the desert had a way of taking what it wanted and leaving only dust behind. When the sky began to dim to copper and gray, Tyen's strength finally gave out. The fever that had been creeping through her body now burned like wildfire. Her vision blurred, colors twisted into strange shapes. The horizon shimmered as if spirits moved there. She thought she saw her mother's silhouette walking toward her through the heat haze, her arms open, her smile gentle. "Mother?" Tyen whispered. "Is it time?" But the figure vanished with the wind. Her body trembled. The pain in her leg pulsed with each heartbeat. Sweat rolled into her eyes, mixing with tears. She had survived the fall, the chase, the fire. And yet it seemed her life would end here, beneath a patch of desert sky that no one would remember. Her voice was faint, almost gone, when she whispered to the wind, "Dasan, don't come back, don't die for me." The wind answered with a sigh through the brush, and then another sound. Footsteps. Tyen's eyes fluttered open. At first she thought it was another fever dream. But then a shadow fell across her face, blotting out the sun. She smelled smoke and iron, and a rough hand brushed the sand from her cheek. "You still breathe," a voice said. It was him. Dasan knelt beside her, his arm bleeding, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His bow was broken in half, the string hanging loose. Blood darkened the cloth around his ribs, but his eyes, those sharp, steady eyes, were alive. "They're gone," he said simply. "For now." She wanted to speak, but no sound came. He reached into his pouch, drew out a strip of jerky and a handful of dried berries, and placed them near her lips. "Eat," he ordered softly. "You need strength." Her hand trembled as she tried to take the food. He steadied it, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his skin. Tyen chewed slowly, the taste of salt and dust grounding her back into the living world. Dasan looked over the valley, scanning for more riders. The horizon was empty, only wind and shadow. Satisfied, he turned back to her. "You can't stay here," he said. "The night brings worse than men." He slid his arms beneath her again. She tried to protest, but he ignored it. "Your fever's rising," he murmured. "You'll burn before morning if we don't find shade." He carried her through the falling dusk, his breath uneven but determined. The sun dipped below the ridge and the desert cooled to blue and violet. Coyotes began to sing far away, a mournful, haunting chorus. At last, they reached a narrow canyon. The air was cooler there, the ground scattered with soft dust and sage. A shallow cave opened in the rock wall, hidden behind hanging vines. Dasan ducked inside, laid Tyen down, and collapsed beside her, his strength finally breaking. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of a small fire he built from dry twigs and brush. Its light danced across the stone walls, revealing ancient handprints painted long ago, ghosts of their ancestors watching. Tyen's fever worsened. She tossed in her sleep, whispering in Apache, calling for her mother, for her brothers, for home. Dasan stayed beside her, soaking a cloth in water and pressing it to her forehead. When her breathing grew shallow, he sang, a low, rhythmic chant, the song of healing his grandmother had sung when his brother lay dying. Hours passed. Then, slowly, her body relaxed. Her breath steadied. The fever broke with the night wind. Dasan exhaled, closing his eyes. Exhaustion pulled at him, but he would not sleep. Not yet. He watched her face in the dim glow of the fire, the flicker of life returning, the stubborn strength in her even as she dreamed. "You are not meant to die here," he whispered. The stars wheeled silently above the canyon, bright and endless. And though the desert around them was wide and wild, inside that cave, for the first time in years, Dasan did not feel alone. Morning came quietly to the canyon, soft and golden, the light filtering through the vines that veiled the cave. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and damp stone. Tyen stirred, her eyelids heavy, her mind swimming between sleep and waking. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was firelight dancing on the walls and the silhouette of a man sitting nearby, Dasan. He was sharpening an arrowhead, his movements slow, deliberate, and soundless. His face was half lit by the flames, the rest lost in shadow. The bandages around his ribs were dark with dried blood, but he worked as if pain were a stranger. Tayen tried to sit up, but a sharp ache shot through her leg. She bit her lip and fell back. The sound made Dasan glance toward her. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. "You live," he said simply, setting the arrow aside. "That's good." Her voice was weak, cracked from fever. "I thought you were gone." "I nearly was," he admitted, standing to stir the ashes. "They followed me farther than I planned, but they won't trouble us again." He handed her a bowl made from a hollowed gourd filled with warm broth. It smelled of herbs and meat, simple, earthy, healing. She drank slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest. "Where are we?" she asked. "Hidden canyon near Dry Mesa," he replied. "Few men know the way. My people used to bring the wounded here when the fighting was bad." He glanced toward the cave's walls where faded red handprints and old symbols traced a story long forgotten. "No one comes anymore." Tayen's gaze lingered on those handprints. "Your ancestors?" He nodded. "Ours, before the soldiers came, before the borders." Silence fell, comfortable this time. Outside, a hawk cried from the ridge, its shadow sweeping across the canyon mouth. Tayen's eyes followed it until she turned back to him. "You risked your life for me," she said softly. "You didn't have to." Dawson's expression didn't change, but his hand stilled. "I didn't think," he said after a moment. "I just heard your cry." She watched him closely, the way his eyes drifted to the fire instead of her, the way he carried his pain in quiet, invisible ways. "You've lost someone too," she said. It wasn't a question, he didn't deny it. He only stared into the flames. "A brother," he said finally. "We rode together in the last war. He wanted peace. I wanted vengeance. When he fell, the fire inside me burned everything, so I walked away from the tribe. From everything." Tayen listened, her fingers clutching the blanket he'd wrapped around her. "You think the spirit sent me to punish you?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Or to remind me the world still bleeds." She said nothing after that, but her eyes softened. Days passed in the quiet rhythm of survival. Tayen's fever faded, though her leg remained bound in bark and cloth. Dason hunted small game, brought back quail and rabbit, sometimes traded meat for herbs with a silent nod to distant riders who passed along the canyon edge. He spoke little, moved like part of the wind itself. Tayen began to know the sounds of his world, the scrape of flint on stone, the rustle of his steps, the low hum of songs he never sang to the end. Sometimes, when he thought she slept, he would sit by the cave's entrance, looking out toward the horizon with eyes that carried 1,000 memories. One night, when the moon was full and the desert glowed silver, Tayen crawled closer to the opening. Dasan sat there, still as a carving. The wind swept his hair across his face and the moonlight traced the scar along his jaw. "Does it ever stop?" she asked quietly. He didn't turn. "What?" "The pain." Dasan's shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. "It changes," he said. "Some days it's a whisper. Other days it roars." Tayen nodded, looking out at the vast night. "Then maybe that's what we are, what's left when the roar quiets." He finally looked at her, his eyes catching the moonlight. "Maybe." In the distance, a coyote called, and its cry echoed through the canyon like a lullaby. For the first time since the raid, Tayen felt something stir inside her, something small and steady. Not hope, not yet, but the beginning of it. Dasan watched her lean back against the cave wall, her eyelids heavy again. He pulled the blanket up to her shoulders and whispered a word she didn't hear, something old and sacred, meant to guard her dreams. Outside, the wind carried their silence across the canyon, over the stones marked by ghosts, toward the sleeping desert beyond. The desert had learned to sleep under the weight of silence. Weeks passed in that hidden canyon, where the days bled into each other like the shifting colors of sand. Tayen healed slowly. The wound in her leg no longer bled, though it remained stiff and swollen, wrapped tight in clean bandages that smelled faintly of pine and sage. She could stand for brief moments leaning on the cave wall, and sometimes walk a few steps before the pain forced her back down. Each morning, Dasan left before sunrise. He returned at dusk with food, herbs, or water, his movements quiet and practiced. He never said where he went. But Tyan noticed the way his gaze searched the horizon when he came back, how his hand hovered near his knife, how he always stopped to listen before stepping into the cave. Something in him was restless, like a wolf that sensed danger long before it showed its teeth. One afternoon, Tyan limped outside for the first time since her fall. The air was sharp with the scent of rain, rare and fleeting in these lands. The sky hung low and gray, thunder murmuring in the far hills. She looked out across the valley and saw nothing but endless stone and sagebrush. Yet the stillness of it made her uneasy. "Dasan?" she called softly. He was a few yards away, setting traps near the edge of the ridge. He turned, his expression unreadable. "You should stay inside. I need to move my leg," she said stubbornly. "It's stronger now." He frowned but didn't argue. Tyan took another step, testing her balance. Her leg held, though pain shot through it like a hot wire. Dasan watched her closely, the faintest flicker of pride in his eyes before it disappeared. But then his head snapped toward the west. A sound, distant, low, and wrong. The soft, rhythmic thunder of hooves. Tyan froze. "What is it?" Dasan didn't answer. He climbed to a rock ledge and crouched low, scanning the horizon. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke and iron. His jaw clenched. "Riders," he said at last. 5, maybe 6. "They're following the dry riverbed." Her blood ran cold. "The same men?" He nodded. "They've been circling for days, maybe tracking prints I left near the ridge." He cursed under his breath, a sound she'd never heard from him before. "They shouldn't have found this place." Tyan's throat tightened. "What do we do?" Dasan's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, already mapping the terrain. "You go back inside. Don't leave until I say." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You can't face them alone again." He turned to her, his tone suddenly firm. "You don't understand, Tyan. This canyon is the only thing between them and you. It narrows to one path. I can hold it." She limped forward, anger mixing with fear. "And if they kill you?" He looked down at her, and for a moment something raw flickered in his eyes, something almost like peace. "Then they'll have to walk through my spirit first." Thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the canyon floor. Dasan checked his bow, slung a quiver over his shoulder, and tied a strip of leather around his wounded ribs. "Go inside," he said one last time. Tyan hesitated. Her heart ached to stop him, to beg him to stay. But she saw the resolve in his face. The quiet, unstoppable kind that came from men who had already faced death and returned. She stepped back. "You'll come back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You always do." Dasan gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If the wind favors me." Then he vanished into the rocks, moving swift and silent as the storm gathering above. Rain began to fall in thin, cold threads. Tyan retreated into the cave, heart pounding. She sat near the entrance, gripping her knife, though she knew it was useless. The sky darkened to the color of ash. Lightning flared across the horizon, revealing shapes in the distance. Men on horseback, rifles slung, moving in a slow, searching line. The first thunderclap drowned out their shouts. Tyan pressed a hand against her chest, whispering a prayer. She could no longer see Dasan, only the flashes of lightning painting the canyon walls. Then faintly, she heard it. An arrow's whistle, sharp and fast. A cry followed, then silence. The rain came harder. The storm swallowed the sounds of men, of battle, of life itself. Tyan knelt near the fire, trembling, her eyes fixed on the mouth of the cave. She didn't know if Dasan still breathed, but she whispered his name again and again, each time softer, each time more desperate, as if the wind itself might carry it to him. Outside, the desert roared in storm and darkness. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with smoke and dust. By dawn, the canyon had become a graveyard of echoes. Hooves striking stone, shouts fading into silence, and the whisper of arrows slicing through the wind. Tyan hadn't slept. Her fingers were numb from clutching the knife all night, her eyes red and swollen from smoke and tears. When the first light crept across the horizon, she saw him, a dark shape moving along the ridge. Crouched low and steady, Dasan. Her heart leapt, but before she could rise, another shadow appeared behind him, then another. There were still men alive. Dasan dropped to one knee, loosing an arrow that cut through the dawn. One of the riders pitched sideways off his horse, vanishing into the mist. The others spread out, shouting in English, voices harsh and panicked. They fired blindly into the rocks, bullets sparking off stone. Tyann crawled to the cave's mouth, gripping the wall for balance. "Dasan!" She called in a hoarse whisper. He didn't turn. He was focused, his movements sharp and deliberate. Every step he took seemed measured, every breath controlled. This was not the man who had tended her wounds with gentle hands. This was the hunter, the survivor, the last Apache warrior of his clan. He moved downhill, disappearing into the folds of the canyon. The gunfire stopped for a moment. The wind carried only the groan of wounded horses and the caw of a distant raven. Then, silence. Tyann waited, her heartbeat filling her ears. She wanted to run to him to see if he was alive, but fear pinned her to the ground. She took one step out of the cave, then froze. A figure stumbled into view. One of the white men, tall, bleeding, dragging a rifle through the dirt. His coat was torn, his face burned by the sun. He looked half mad. When his eyes found her, they widened with recognition and hatred. "There you are," he rasped, raising his gun. Tyann's scream caught in her throat. She fell backward, searching for the knife, but her leg gave out beneath her. The man aimed, his hand shaking. Before he could fire, a shape burst from the side of the ridge, a blur of movement and fury. Dasan hit him full force, knocking the rifle from his grip. The two men crashed to the ground, rolling in the dirt, fists and blades flashing. The sound was animal. Grunts, snarls, the thud of bodies colliding. Tyann crawled forward, desperate and terrified. Dasan pinned the man down, but the outlaw's knife slashed across his arm, drawing blood. Dasan gritted his teeth and drove his knee into the man's chest, wrenching the blade free. A gunshot rang out, close, deafening. Tyann flinched, covering her ears. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the outlaw's hand fell limp. The revolver clattered to the rocks. Dasan sat back, breathing hard, blood streaming from a cut across his temple. He turned toward Tyann, his face pale beneath the dust. "It's done," he said quietly. But Tyann's gaze went past him and toward the ridge. Two more riders had appeared, their silhouettes sharp against the light. One raised a rifle. Dasan spun around, but he was too late. The shot hit him square in the shoulder. He stumbled backward, falling hard against the rocks. "Dasan!" Tyann screamed, running to him despite the pain in her leg. Bullets hit the ground near her feet, sending up bursts of dirt and stone. She threw herself beside him, dragging his body toward the cave with every ounce of strength left in her. He was heavy, his breath shallow. "Leave me," he gasped, trying to push her away. "Never!" she hissed, teeth clenched, her face streaked with tears and dust. Another shot whistled past, grazing her arm. The cave was only a few feet away now. She pulled him inside, just as the next bullet shattered a rock where his head had been seconds before. Inside, Tyann collapsed beside him, panting. Blood soaked through his shirt. She pressed her hand against the wound, trying to stop the flow. "You can't die," she whispered fiercely. "Not now. Not after everything." Dasan's hand found hers, weak, trembling. "They'll come," he murmured. "If I don't stop them." "You already did," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You saved me." He looked at her then, really looked, as though memorizing her face, the curve of her lips, the fierce fire in her eyes. Outside, the riders shouted to each other, circling the canyon like vultures. Dasan reached for his knife again, his voice rough and steady. "Then we fight together." Tyann nodded, her fear burning away into something else. Something wild, ancient and unyielding. She took up the fallen revolver, her hands shaking but ready. As the sun broke through the clouds, the canyon came alive once more with the sound of gunfire, courage, and dust. And in that chaos, two souls stood side by side, wounded, hunted, but unbroken. Night returned to the canyon like a curtain of smoke. The fire had burned down to embers, and the smell of blood and gunpowder clung to everything, to the sand, the stone, the air. Tyann sat with her back against the cave wall, her hands red from pressing against Dasan's wound. The bleeding had slowed, but his skin was pale, his breath shallow. Outside, the desert was silent. The men who had come for them were gone, or dead. The wind carried no voices, only the low hum of distant thunder fading beyond the hills. Tyann dipped a strip of cloth into a bowl of water and wiped the blood from Dasan's face. His eyelids fluttered, his lips cracked from thirst. She lifted his head and held the rim of a canteen to his mouth. "Drink," she whispered. "You need to drink." He obeyed weakly, a drop of water sliding down his chin. "How many left?" he murmured. "None," she lied. "They're gone." He gave a faint, knowing smile. "You're a terrible liar, Tayan." Her jaw tightened. "Then rest. Save your strength." She sat beside him in silence, watching the flicker of the dying fire. The rain outside had stopped completely, leaving the canyon washed clean, every rock shining under the thin moonlight. But Tayan could feel it. Danger hadn't left. It was only waiting. Every few moments she thought she heard a sound, the scrape of boots, the creak of leather. But when she turned, there was only the wind. Hours passed. Dasan drifted in and out of sleep, his hand occasionally twitching toward his knife even in dreams. Tayan's exhaustion pressed down on her like a stone, but she refused to close her eyes. She had already lost too much. Her village, her people, her father. She would not lose him too. When the darkness began to pale into dawn, Tayan stood, legs trembling, and stepped outside. The world was quiet, painted in shades of blue and silver. The ground bore the scars of battle, hoofprints, arrows, the burned remains of a campfire. She walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down into the valley, and then she saw it, a flicker of movement far below. A horse, a single rider, her breath caught. He was coming back. She hurried inside, shaking Dasan's shoulder. "There's someone," she whispered. "A rider, alone." Dasan forced himself upright, pain twisting across his face. "Describe him." "I can't see his face, but he's coming from the north." Dasan's hand tightened around hers. "Then it's not one of mine." He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Tayan caught him before he fell, her heart pounding. "No, you can't fight again." He looked at her, a look heavy with memory and grief. "You don't understand. I can't hide while others die for me." "Then let me go," she said, surprising herself. "Let me see who it is." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Stay low. If it's trouble, don't run. The canyon will trap you. Wait for my signal." Tayan took his bow, lighter than she expected, and stepped out into the gray light. The rider was closer now, moving slowly, head bowed. When the sun's first edge broke over the horizon, she saw the glint of metal on his saddle. A rifle. Her pulse quickened. She crouched behind a boulder, arrow nocked, breath steady. The rider reached the narrow pass at the canyon's mouth and stopped. Then he raised a hand, an open, empty bar, and spoke. The words carried faintly on the morning air. "Peace." "I come alone." Tayan hesitated. The voice was rough, older. Not the same as the men who had hunted them. She rose slightly, keeping the bow trained. "Who are you?" she called. The man removed his hat, revealing a face lined by years and sun. His hair was gray at the temples, his expression wary but not cruel. "Name's Silas Hart," he said. "Used to ride with the 7th Cavalry, before I saw what they did to your people. I'm not here to fight." Tayan lowered the bow slightly but didn't move closer. "Then why come?" He glanced toward the cave. "Looking for the man they call Dasan. Heard he saved a girl up on the cliffs. Figured he'd need a friend before the army comes back." Her blood ran cold. "The army?" He nodded grimly. "They'll be here by nightfall." Tayan's gaze flicked toward the cave where Dasan waited in the shadows. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. One battle had ended, but another was already on its way. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of rain and fire. And in that moment, Tayan understood. Their story wasn't one of escape. It was one of survival. Dasan stepped into the light behind her, wounded but standing, his eyes fixed on the horizon where smoke began to rise once more. "Then we don't wait," he said quietly. "We move before dawn's gone." The sun had barely climbed over the ridges when the 3 riders left the canyon. Tayan sat behind Dasan on the horse, her arms wrapped gently around his waist to keep him steady. His wound was freshly bound, but every step the animal took made his breath catch. Silas Hart rode beside them, silent and watchful, scanning every shadow and ridge. Behind them, the smoke from the burned camp still rose into the pale morning like a final warning. They moved fast through the scrubland, where the air shimmered and the scent of sage was sharp as steel. The path wound through old riverbeds and hidden gullies, routes known only to those who had once called this desert home. "The army will take the main trail," Silas said over his shoulder. "They'll think you're heading east." Dasan nodded faintly. "Then we ride west, through the fire mesa." Tayan turned to him, startled. "That's suicide. There's nothing there but stone and heat." "Exactly," Dasan murmured. "No one follows a ghost trail." Silas gave a short, grim laugh. You Apaches always did have strange ideas about safety. They rode until noon. The sun beat down with merciless fire, burning through the bandages on Tyann's arms, drying the blood that had soaked into Dasan's shirt. The world shimmered. Endless ridges of red rock and gold sand, the air alive with mirages. When they stopped in the shade of a boulder, Dasan slid off the horse, his knees buckling. Tyann caught him before he hit the ground. Enough, she said. You can't go farther like this. He shook his head. If we stop now, we die. Silas crouched, checking the horizon. He's right. Look there, Tyann followed his gaze. Far in the distance, a faint dust cloud rose and riders. Dozens of them. Moving fast, her stomach twisted. How did they? Army scouts, Silas muttered. They move like locusts. We keep going. Tyann helped Dasan back onto the horse. He swayed but stayed upright, his eyes fixed on the burning land ahead. She climbed behind him again and they pushed onward. By late afternoon, the heat turned cruel. The wind changed when hot, dry, smelling of smoke. Tyann squinted toward the horizon and froze. The world ahead was burning. A wildfire had taken the mesa. Flames raced across the scrub, devouring everything in their path. The sky turned black with smoke and the wind carried embers like swarms of fireflies. Silas reined his horse hard. We can't go through that. Dasan's eyes narrowed. We have no choice. The army will drive us into it either way. Tyann's voice broke. We'll die! He looked back at her, his face streaked with sweat and blood. Then we die together. Before Silas could protest, Dasan kicked his horse forward. The animal screamed, then charged into the smoke. Tyann buried her face against his back as heat seared her skin. The world vanished into flame and thunder, crackling brush, falling ash, the roar of wind. They rode through hell itself. Silas followed, shouting curses lost in the storm. The horses stumbled, blinded by smoke, hooves sinking into burning sand. Tyann's throat felt raw, every breath fire. She clung tighter, feeling Dasan's body shake with exhaustion. Then, through the smoke, she saw a gap. A narrow canyon half hidden by flame where the fire hadn't yet reached. There, she screamed, pointing. Dasan steered toward it, barely conscious. The horse leapt over a burning log and into the dark passage beyond. The sudden coolness hit them like mercy. They galloped deeper until the roar of the fire faded to a distant hum. When they finally stopped, Tyann slid off, coughing hard, her face blackened with soot. She looked up. The sky above the canyon was tinted red, like blood reflected in water. Dasan swayed in the saddle, eyes half closed. She caught him as he fell. His body was burning with fever. Silas dismounted, panting, wiping ash from his beard. We made it, he said hoarsely. But we'll need shelter before nightfall. Tyann looked around. The canyon was deep, lined with rock walls carved by ancient rivers. There was water somewhere nearby, she could smell it. She turned back to Silas. There's a spring to the north, she said. My people once camped here. Together they carried Dasan to a shallow cave near the stream. Tyann tore her shawl to make new bandages. Silas gathered dry wood from the shadows. Outside, the fire still glowed in the distance, painting the horizon with fury. Tyann sat beside Dasan, cooling his forehead with damp cloth. His breathing was uneven, but he was alive. She whispered, We're safe now. His lips moved faintly, barely a breath. No one's safe. Until it ends. Silas looked toward the smoke rising over the mesa. He's right, he said quietly. They'll come again. They always do. But Tyann didn't answer. She held Dasan's hand, watching the reflection of fire flicker in his dark eyes that still refused to surrender. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, not from the sky but from hooves. The army was coming. Dawn came slow and red, as if the sky itself had bled in the night. The canyon lay still, wrapped in smoke and silence. The wildfire had burned out, leaving behind only blackened earth and the bitter scent of ash. Tyann sat beside Dasan, her head resting against his shoulder, her fingers still locked around his hand. He was awake, barely, his skin hot from fever, his breathing ragged. But his eyes, when they opened, were clear. They'll be here soon, he said quietly. Tyann nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. She had seen them at dawn, dark figures moving along the ridge. Soldiers, maybe 20, maybe more. They were searching spreading out like wolves closing in on a wounded deer. Silas Hart loaded the last of his ammunition into a battered revolver. "We don't have the firepower for this," he said. "Not even close." Dasan shifted, forcing himself to sit upright. "Then we make them think we do." Tyen turned to him sharply. "You can barely stand." "I don't need to stand," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I just need them to believe." Silas frowned. "You got a plan, Apache?" Dasan met his gaze. "We use the canyon. Draw them in. Smoke and Echo will do the rest." He pointed toward a narrow bend where the cliffs leaned close together. "There," he said. "They'll have to come single file. We'll make them think they're walking into 100 rifles." Silas gave a slow grin. "A bluff." "I like it," Tyen didn't smile. She rose, moving toward the canyon's edge where she could already hear the distant clatter of hooves. "And when they find out it's only 3 of us?" Dasan's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Then we make our last stand count." By mid-morning, the first soldiers appeared, shadows against the rising sun. They came cautious but confident, rifles ready, led by a man with a red scarf tied around his arm. His voice echoed through the canyon. "Lay down your weapons. You're surrounded." Silas fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the rocks. "If we're surrounded," he shouted back, "you might want to tighten the noose before we cut through it." The echo of the gunshot bounced through the canyon, splitting into a dozen ghostly sounds. The soldiers hesitated, unsure how many guns waited for them in the shadows. Dasan lay near the bend, bow drawn, arrows lined beside him like soldiers waiting for command. Tyen crouched beside him with Silas's spare rifle, her hands trembling but her eyes unflinching. The soldiers advanced, one step, then another. "Now," Dasan whispered. Silas fired again from a different rock ledge this time. Tyen pulled the trigger too, the sound overlapping, echoing from both sides of the canyon. Smoke filled the air. The soldiers ducked for cover, shouting to each other, thinking they were outnumbered. Dasan released an arrow. It struck the lead horse, sending the animal rearing back, throwing its rider. Panic rippled through the line. More arrows flew, each one striking dust and stone where it would make the most noise. The canyon seemed alive, filled with invisible fighters, but the ruse wouldn't last. After a moment's confusion, the soldiers regrouped. "It's a trick," one yelled. "They're few, push forward." Bullets tore through the smoke. Tyen dropped behind a boulder, dust spraying her face. Silas fired until his revolver clicked empty. Dasan loosed one last arrow before a bullet shattered the rock beside him, cutting a gash across his cheek. Tyen grabbed his arm. "We have to fall back." He shook his head. "No more running." Then he did something she didn't expect. He took her hand and pressed it against his heart. "If I fall, you ride north. Follow the water. There's a village there that will take you." Tyen's eyes filled with tears. "Don't you dare speak like that," he gave a faint smile. "Then promise me one thing, live." Before she could answer, another bullet whistled past. Silas shouted from across the canyon. "They're flanking left." Dasan rose despite the pain and stepped into the open. He drew back his last arrow, the string trembling. The red-scarfed officer lifted his rifle to fire, and Dasan released. The arrow struck true. The officer fell. Chaos erupted. Soldiers broke formation, shouting, retreating into confusion. Silas whooped and fired another shot, driving them back. The sound of hooves filled the air again, but this time from the north. Figures appeared along the ridge. Apaches, wild and fierce, war paint streaked across their faces. Dasan's people, survivors. They charged down the slope, howling war cries that shook the air. The soldiers panicked, scattering like dust in the wind. Tyen stared, wide-eyed. "You sent for them." Dasan sank to his knees, exhaustion claiming him. "I told you," he murmured, voice faint but proud. "No one fights alone." By sunset, the battle was over. Smoke drifted through the canyon once more, but this time it carried the scent of freedom. The soldiers were gone, the land quiet except for the whisper of the wind.